Welcome to the Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. We're here to share stories of real river accidents and rescues and find expert advice on how to solve the problems you might encounter in the Whitewater River environment. I'm your host, Jack Diddy, an emergency medicine physician, whitewater paddler, and wilderness medicine educator. Together, I hope we can celebrate successful rescues and learn from our mistakes in a supportive environment. If you have a story to share of a non-fatal accident or rescue, send me an email at thesafetybreak@gmail.com or contact me on our Facebook page, The Safety Break. If you like what you hear, hit the subscribe button and follow us on social media. I hope you learned something valuable in the show.
There are people that have been paddling Overflow since when it first started getting run on the river that day and from the 80s on. And we were all being way more careful than we normally would have been. And I honestly think this particular situation, even if we had gotten out and scouted it, we may have overlooked this log. So it's super scary.
I don't know. It's a good reminder not just to get out and scout blind, but also to look really critically at those drops, because something can be hiding just behind the veil,
Welcome to the Safety Break. In our last episode, we heard about a solo encounter with a strainer in Montana, with the paddler cutting himself free just before his time underwater ran out. Today we have another strainer story. This one is from the upper reaches of the Chattooga watershed in northern Georgia, on Overflow Creek. The rapid in this story is unironically named Blind Drop, and the strainer in this case is particularly deceptive, as it is well hidden from view even if you know where to look for it. The cover photo for this episode, provided by C1 paddler extraordinaire Oscar Zuckner, shows the rapid, with the log barely visible extending from the river left side of the ledge down into the center of the drop. There were several groups on the creek that day, and this thing dished out some serious beatdowns for each of them. I first read about this story on one of the regional southeastern kayaking Facebook groups, as a few of the affected paddlers posted about the hazard. There was some discussion at that time about what to do once you find one of these hidden death traps. So we'll talk about that as we hear this story. Our guests today are Scott Sullivan and Nathan Pauley. They both have years of experience on this creek, decades actually in Scott's case. They were paddling the creek in late December and were among the first group down that day, and probably the first crew to run the river after the flooding from Hurricane Helene last fall. As Scott describes, they all knew the river well and were being extra careful and vigilant due to the possibility of changes from the storm. So let's meet our guests, Scott and Nathan, and hear their description of the events that day.
My name's Scott Sullivan. I've lived in the Southeast and kayaked in the Southeast since I was in high school in the late 80s. Longtime outdoor industry paddle sports rep, former guide on the Chattooga, still guide some in the Grand Canyon, still doing a lot of kayaking in the area. Yeah, well, Overflows, it probably, of all the places I've paddled all over the world, it's probably the closest to my heart, one of my favorite places on the planet. But yeah, I've been paddling Overflow since the early 90s, and I still pretty much drop most of what I'm doing if I know it's got water in it.
My name's Nathan Pauley. I'm an environmental scientist from the Atlanta area originally, Marietta, but have lived up here by the Chattooga for 6 years now, and have loved it ever since. I paddled the first time when I was still in Atlanta, got shown down by Burton Greer and Chip Albo and Greg Tim, and I've never really looked back. It's like my go-to, backyard rain-fed run. It is extremely remote, and so there is a lot of chances of wood, but the known spots where wood tends to accumulate are well checked.
It's the headwaters of the Chattooga River, which is free-flowing, a wild and scenic river. It only runs after heavy rainfall, and it usually has a pretty short window to get in there. It's very small, has some waterfalls. It's drop pool, a lot of bedrock drops. A lot of it's just like a nice class 4 creeking with some bigger ones thrown in there, but the nature of it with being so small and tight with blind corners and a lot of, hemlock damage and overhanging trees makes it, I would say, class 5, especially depending on the level, very level dependent. And it is notorious for being chocked with wood in different places, and it always moves around. It's just constantly changing, so you've always got to be on your toes.
When you're getting on overflow, especially after a rain, that you need to be pretty cognizant of it. In fact, a couple of years ago, I might have been with Scott Sullivan again, but we were coming down and it was our second lap. So we'd already done all the scouting and looking around and stuff. And between laps, some wood fell into the river above and the rapid that leads into Blind. And you were like, oh, wow, this wood that was not there before is now here. So it was a good reminder then to be really cognizant of wood on that run.
This was, I believe it was December 30th. It was right before New Year's. And it was the first time really that it had been pretty dry after Helene. And I think this was the first time overflow really ran. So no one had really been in there to see what the situation was. And it was just a moderate level, like 1.4 on the gauge, I think, which is just like a nice medium low. Well, there was 3 of us that put on. We met about daybreak up there, went up to the put in, and we knew there were a few other groups coming. One of which we were trying to get back down to the takeout to meet to do a second run, which didn't come to fruition. But we put on. It was probably 7:30 in the morning, and it was the first run since Helene, and we knew how high it had gotten in there, so we were being super careful. Honestly, up until that point, we had scouted, and this isn't very common to do this, because normally you talk to someone who gives you a wood report or have been in there more recently without a major event. We were being super careful, scouting pretty much everything we couldn't see the bottom of, just to make sure there wasn't wood. And it had all been going pretty smoothly. It was pretty clean. I think we had one or two portages just in flat water over some logs, but nothing major. And the rapids up until Blind Falls were clean. And then we got to Blind Falls. Basically has kind of a long lead in, just like a bedrock kind of wavy lead in, and then it drops off. It's probably a 14-foot, 15-foot drop. I don't know, but you can't see the bottom of it. But there's a couple of eddies right above it, and it looked clean from the top. Normally if there was something down there, you'd see something like a branch or something from above just to give you a heads up. Person in front of me, Nathan, did basically a spin in the last eddy, looked over his shoulder and went off the drop. And I was not too far behind him and didn't hear anything, a shout or anything. So I just ran. I think partly it might have been the boat I was in that helped me. I was in a Scorch X, and I went off the drop, didn't feel anything weird. It can be kind of bouncy if you're over on the right side. And I landed in the pool, and he was nowhere to be seen. And so, pretty much immediately I knew something was wrong, because I knew he wouldn't, especially since we were going slow because it was the first one after the storm. I just knew something was wrong. So I immediately paddled over the shore. There was nothing. There was no paddle, no boat, no Nathan, no nothing. And I ran up the bank, and I still couldn't figure out what was going on. You couldn't see this tree. There's no evidence in the pool. And basically it was chalked across the rapid under the water. And I only really started to see it after I really was looking to see what was going on. But the log was across the drop in such a way that there was a gap between the log and the lip of the waterfall, I guess where the bedrock ends. And when I went over it, I just cleared the whole thing. basically I realized he was behind the falls. And still nothing had come out. And, I ran up there with my throw bag. It was just my friend Steve, who was behind me, ran. He got out of his boat, ran up there. This all took a few minutes before we saw anything happen. I mean, I want to say it was 3 minutes. It was long enough to where we both thought that it wasn't going to be a rescue. And then all of a sudden, a paddle came out, boat comes out, and then Nathan comes out and just popped up, not out of breath at all, and just swam over to shore. So turns out, and none of us knew this. I have not talked to anyone that knew there was a pocket back there, but there's a cave in behind the falls that you can actually stand up in the corner of. So he was just back there trying to figure out the best way to get out.
So that was Scott's perspective of the situation. Here's how it went down from Nathan's point of view.
It was relatively uneventful. We were making really good time until Blind Falls, which is named because it is traditionally run blind. It's a blind corner. So you're coming down this hallway. There's Roto on one side. There's like Steep Gorge on the other. And you're coming down and the river takes a hard left turn. It turns a 90-degree angle. And it's traditionally run by skittering over the right side of the falls, which is kind of shallow, and boofing into this like slot corridor. I was first coming down, and so there's like a last chance eddy right at the lip of the falls. And so I came down, and this is what I've always done up until now. I won't be doing this anymore, but I caught that eddy, and I looked over my shoulder to see if there was anything in the drop. And from my perspective, it looked clean. And so I ran my standard line, and as I disconnected from the shelf, I reconnected with something, and then I was upside down and underwater, and I did not know what was going on. I tried to roll once, and I now assume that I hit the top of the cave with my boat, and I could feel water below me, and I knew that I met resistance when I tried to roll, so I pulled the skirt and popped up in the cave. And there's a little bit of a shelf back there, so I had all my stuff. My paddle was in my hand. My boat was right there. I just reached out and grabbed it. And at some point, I remember seeing Steve Yook come over and over top of me, smash into the log. And he goes forward instead of pitching backwards like I did. I think maybe if I had not scouted, if I not caught that eddy and just ran it direct, I would have had more momentum and I would have gone forward instead of backwards into the cave. And so I'm a little frazzled. I'm in the cave. Scott runs over me, does the same thing as well. And I'm I throw my paddle out, knowing that they're out there. And I really regret not blowing my whistle at this point, because I knew they were out there and they had no idea where I was. I ran before them and I was gone right from their perspective. But in the moment, I was trying to wrestle my boat out of the curtain. I was trying to push it out of the curtain before I swam out myself. Tried doing that for a little bit, but the boat was filling up with water. And as it was filling up with water, it was starting to push into my legs in the cave. And I didn't want to get pinned back there. So I wound up being this is not worth the boat, and jumping over the log and out of the cave. At some point, the boat flushed. But when I got out of the cave, I looked to my right, and Steve and Scott are both running up the bank to try and figure out where the hell I am. But yeah, they got my paddle for me. Steve, I reached out and grabbed my boat. I was sitting there. I'd just gotten to shore, and the boat comes floating out, thank God. And I just reach out and grab it and put it on the bank.
At that point, Nathan was safe and sound, and his gear was collected. But they realized that several other groups might be paddling down the creek and would encounter this same situation. The problem was that they had no way to communicate with them, and no real idea when or even if these groups would actually show up. And the log was too big and difficult to access to remove it with the tools they had available.
We then debated, do we wait here? It was cold. This was like the end of December. We went up and made cairns and hung anything bright we could find from the overhanging rhododendron to try to mark it. But there were two groups behind us, and we debated waiting, trying to catch our friends at the takeout, waiting on the other group that was behind us. And finally, we left and decided to go try to catch our friends at the takeout to warn them, thinking we had left enough of a marker, which was, in fact, not enough for the guys behind us. They didn't see it. The second crew, there was 4 people. The first paddler made it over and was in the pool below and watched the next 3 people go behind the log into the cave. So in that group, there were 3 people in this cave all at the same time. And it was the same situation. Like, until something came out, he had no idea what was going on. Like, he just felt helpless. And then the third group, who we failed to, so we tried to warn the second group with these things that we hung from the rotos and everything, which didn't work. The third group, we were trying to get to the takeout in time to catch them. We missed them. Then they came down. One person went behind the tree, and I think cracked some ribs and swam and came out, but didn't even know he had gone in the cave. And then the rest of that crew made it over, except for one person who went in the cave and was in there by himself, if memory serves me right. And he was in there for like 15 minutes just before he figured out what to do and finally got out. So the good news is that there's a big place to get air back there, and that you can get out without too much difficulty. But the bad news was that this tree was, regardless of how careful you were, I mean, I feel like even if we had gotten out and looked at it, we might have not seen it.
So in this incident, removing this log on site was not really an option, mainly due to the difficulty of accessing it with the full flow of the creek. In general, though, if you ever encounter this type of life-threatening strainer, and if you have the skills and time to do so, the gold standard approach is to try to drag, cut, or otherwise remove the log out of play. Many paddlers carry a small folding saw in their rescue kit, and some of these can cut through remarkably large logs. And this is often a great chance to practice your Z-drag setup as well. Of course, this kind of work can be incredibly dangerous in its own right, with logs that can be under tension from the river current and from gravity, so only tackle jobs that are clearly within your skill set. Try to plan your moves so you don't end up leaving the strainer in a worse position than when you started, and pull any large pieces out above the high water mark so they don't just move into the next pin downstream. In this case, since the log couldn't be removed until the water level dropped out, the group thought a lot about how they could have better warned the other people on the creek that day.
I mean, what I had wished that I had with me and what I have since put in my rescue vest is just some flagging tape. It doesn't take up much space. It doesn't weigh anything. Just jam it in the pocket. Something brighter than what we had might have really helped. But even so, I mean, fishermen put tape up on trees to mark stuff. And, I don't know that it is the end all be all solution. In this situation, we just worked with what we had. Like, we had some red webbing, like a sling. I had some safety orange cord that like had a whistle tied to it. We had a bunch of like permits that people had in their PFDs that are yellow, paper permits. So we built these like Blair Witch Project looking totems and stuck those things all over the top of it, right at the top of the rapid. But like the problem is in this situation, there's overhanging rhododendron. By the time you would get to where you'd see this stuff, I think it's almost too late. And then, having something like very visible and brighter would have really helped. And looking back on it, maybe we should have waited longer. We just had no idea what sort of time frame the other people were on. Or in the second group was a bunch of the younger kids, and we thought that the water level was low. So we talked this over and thought that they may have left to go somewhere else. So we didn't even know they were there for sure. But yeah, I think just something as simple as having, 20 feet of enough flagging to where you really can mark it and make it look like something's going on would have gone a long way in this situation.
I can't remember if it was Scott or Steve when we were trying to put up the flagging, but it was one of them. It was not my idea, but frankly, I think it's a really good one. For features like that, I come down on the side of flagging. I think it's a good thing to have. Rather have it and not need it than need it and not have it, right? I don't necessarily advocate like trashing the natural environment, and it is plastic, and I'm an environmental scientist, so like it's something I care about professionally and personally. But like as long as you're a good steward and like you're doing it for to protect people, and you are communicative with the community about its presence there, and like even carrying like a Sharpie or something on the river in the dry bag to like write on the tape. Before I had my current job, I worked for the Forest Service, and that's a really common practice with the Forest Service is to like take tape out and like tape something and then write on it. Either it's a wetland boundary or this is where, you found a bunch of infected trees or what have you. And so like put out your tape and then write on it like wood blind under veil or something like that. Just super simple to get the point across.
In the online discussion that Nathan posted, he mentioned the idea that yellow caution tape is probably the best type to use, as it conveys a very clear message and is less likely to be confused with other markers used by the Forest Service or landowners. They even make a biodegradable version of this stuff, which might help to ease some of the concerns about leaving plastic litter along streams. And we should certainly abide by the leave no trace ethic as much as possible, so this flagging should be thought of as a temporary solution and taken down as soon as the strainer is removed or washed out of the rapid. Most of those in the online discussion group agreed with the idea, but a couple of counterpoints were also brought up. One person brought up the idea that it might lead to a dumbing down of the dynamic wilderness environment and lead to a more reckless approach when paddlers see a rapid without any obvious warning signs. Certainly a valid concern, but I think this will be an uncommon enough scenario that it doesn't change most people's paddling style or habits. And to be clear, the first message here is that scouting blind drops is imperative. Obviously, this stuff shouldn't be put up for every branch sticking out in the stream bed, but for true life-threatening and blind strainer hazards that cannot be immediately removed on commonly run creeks, I think there seems to be some justification for this as a potential life-saving measure. There's another thing worth mentioning here regarding warnings. The messages about this strainer on Overflow were posted on a couple of social media groups, which surely helped get the word out about it. Don't be shy about blowing up the internet with this kind of information. Try to nail down the exact location, a description of the hazard and the date, and post it up on your regional social media kayaking groups. On the AW website, you can also post alerts that show up on specific stream pages, which offers a more permanent warning, as the posts on social media tend to get buried pretty quickly. Posting a note at the put-in is another option, especially if there is already a message board like you see at some Forest Service trailheads. Nathan and Scott had some other thoughts about group dynamics on these tight creeks and lessons learned.
Should have scouted. That's the real lesson is like look before you leap, especially on these like if you can't see the bottom of a rapid, you should really be looking at it. And that's probably the case between runs too. Even if it's a pain in the ass, like there's a way to scout blind. It's called blind, but like I know folks have scouted it from far right over there. Commit one person, just like we had the whole run. Again, we were like leapfrogging down. Like one person would go out and scout, and then come back and like give everybody the go ahead. If I'd done that, if I'd actually gotten out of my boat to look at it and then given it a good look, hopefully I would have noticed it, and we would have saved ourselves a little heartache.
And the way that I think is safest is make sure that you especially if there's a blind corner or blind drop and you're really on a creek where you're really worried about wood, like sending one person down into the last eddy you can see and not piling up on each other. If you can see visually that it's clear down below into a next eddy, just moving safely that way, like not piling into small eddies and holding people back until you can see below. Is one of the biggest things on something super tight, like on Overflow. If you get in the last small eddy, someone else comes down, they can easily get knocked into the rapid, So that's kind of the way I've always liked to operate, is just moving downstream, not all in a bunch, but just kind of, leapfrogging your way, if that makes sense.
And another thought from Nathan. He brings up the importance of communication attempts between the accident victim and rescuers.
Well, think about if you are the victim, as I was, think about the folks around you too. I could have been a lot more communicative with them. I had a whistle on me. I just wasn't thinking about it. I knew I was safe. So they should know I'm safe too. Because I know, Steve and Scott were not in a great headspace, I think, immediately after I disappeared. And so I think it would have, they would have at least known the score if I'd been blasting the whistle.
So thanks for listening today. Thanks to Oscar Zuckner for the cover photo for this episode. I've also posted a video of his run and his impact with the log that day, which pretty well demonstrates the hazard. You can find the link on our Facebook site. Here's my final few thoughts about strainers before we wrap this up. In general, these things require a very proactive approach in several different respects. The first of these is the constant vigilance that is required, scanning downstream to look for hazards and to look for your next bailout eddy. The second is the immediate response when you see one, taking quick action for avoidance rather than hesitation and indecision. I've seen way too many people drift into strainers because they waited too long, sizing it up as they continued to move forward with the flow rather than immediately looking for their last chance eddy. The third proactive approach is often taught in rescue courses. If you are unavoidably paddling or swimming into one, you should do so very aggressively to try to get up and over it if possible. The fourth proactive response is to remove the strainer if you have the skills and time to do so. If you can't remove it and it's a true life-threatening and blind strainer, consider flagging it to alert other river users of the problem. And finally, blow up your social media pages to let other people know about the issue. Hopefully all these things will help us keep each other alive out there in this complex environment that we play in. And by the way, the last I heard, this log on Overflow is still there. So look before you leap at blind drop, even if you don't see any warning signs. Here's the last word from Scott.
I think it's just important to remember that it's, the river's an ever-changing environment and you can't let your guard down.
Thank you for listening to The Safety Break, the Whitewater Rescue Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, hit the subscribe button and click follow on our Facebook page so we know that you're out there. I'm also looking for more stories. If you know of an interesting non-fatal river accident or rescue, send me a few details by email, safetybreak@gmail.com. It doesn't have to be dramatic or life-threatening, just something that we all might be able to learn from. I'll see if we can turn it into an episode. Stay safe out there, and I hope to see you on the river.